It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is Investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Really excited about our show today. We have Dr. Anthony Feinstein. He's written a book called Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. You could find him on Twitter at Ant Feinstein. And he also runs a nonprofit where he offers therapy to freelance journalists that have been traumatized by their work in journalism and in war zones and things like that. Dr. Anthony Feinstein, are you there?
I am, yes. Hello.
Thank you so much. Tell us about yourself. Before we get into your book here, Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists, tell us about yourself. Who is Dr. Anthony Feinstein?
Yeah, so thanks. I'm a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. I run a research lab where my area of research is quite unrelated to the topic of today's discussion. I research multiple sclerosis. I've been an MS researcher for nearly 30 years and also run a clinical practice. And my interest in journalism is it's a fascinating story. Back in 1999, I was referred a patient to my clinic who had an interesting presentation. They thought she had a neurological disease. It turned out she did not. She was manifesting an extreme stress reaction, and she turned out to be a frontline journalist who had been traumatized working in East Africa, covering a famine. And was through one of my patients that I became interested in this topic of journalism and emotions, conflict, and stress.
Fascinating. So basically, you had a patient that was a journalist, and you noticed signs of like PTSD, I guess the common person would refer to it.
Yeah, she came along to my clinic with some interesting, like quasi-neurological signs. She was having trouble speaking. Her level of consciousness was a bit reduced. So, she was first seen by my colleagues in neurology, and they did a number of brain scans, and they were all clear. The neurological examination was essentially normal, and it turned out to be a very extreme stress reaction, something that today we call a conversion disorder, a functional neurological disorder. And as she recovered, she was able to tell me her story. And she had a very experienced journalist working many years in the field that covered lots of war, conflict, and revolution. And, she'd been getting into emotional difficulties while out in the field, and she had never reached out for help. And I said to her, why had you not asked for assistance? You work for a large Canadian news organization. It was there for you. And she said to me, you don't understand this profession, that if I tell my editors I'm feeling this way, they will never send me out into the field again, and that's the end of my career. And I thought this was really punitive. This was back in 1999. So I said to my MS research team, take a break for the afternoon and let's do a detailed literature search and let's see what's written on journalists and trauma and, PTSD and emotional health. And we never found a single publication. Wow. It was striking. There was not a single article written in this trauma literature. There's a huge literature on veterans, from Vietnam and the wars, the Second World War, Korea, etc. There's a lot of trauma literature on victims of assaults and rape, policemen, ambulance attendants, but nothing on journalists. And so, intrigued by this gap in the literature, I just, put together a very quick grant application and sent it to the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C. And they wrote back, this was a pre-9/11 world. They wrote back to me and said, hey, this is a great idea. We're prepared to fund it. And they funded the very first study looking at journalists and conflict and trauma and their emotional health. And we subsequently published that in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and that led to a book.
Right. I noticed you wrote a previous book, Journalists Under Fire, The Psychological Hazards of Covering War.
Yes, and that came from some of my original research that was funded by the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C., and that was a study looking at journalists in large networks like CNN, the BBC, Reuters, Associated Press. How were these journalists coping with life in war zones? And the data revealed that while this is a very resilient group, there is a core who become very traumatized by this work and who can develop post-traumatic stress disorder and depression and substance abuse. And the rates are not low in this group because they're constantly going back to war, constantly putting themselves in harm's way. And once the study was completed, we gave the data to the news organizations and said, look, this is happening to your correspondents, this is happening to your photographers, and they're not getting any help. That was the other notable finding, that despite the data showing that there was a percentage of these journalists who were traumatized, there was no assistance for them. There was just no discussion about this 22 years back.
And as you were telling me off the air, now you run a nonprofit where you can treat these journalists.
Yeah, for the freelancers. So the freelance journalists who don't work for, for news obligations, they're the ones who struggle financially. They don't have the resources to fund therapy. So I run a non-for-profit fund that provides psychotherapy to freelancers who can't afford it.
Incredible. Now, when you go to Amazon and you look up Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists by Anthony Feinstein, there's another book in there about moral courage. So you want to scroll down a bit. This is the one. It has a picture of about 10 journalists, as moral courage on the cover. Now, Dr. Feinstein, when I flip through your book and I see the faces of these journalists, it seems like they've all have something in common. There's a trauma on their faces.
Well, there's no doubt that they have very, very difficult lives because these are journalists who live in countries that are often very violent, in which civil society has collapsed or is collapsing, in which there may be authoritarian leaders who don't want to support a free press, in fact, to try and crush a free press. There may be very limited freedom of expression. And so these journalists are really going out on a limb to do their work, their investigative reporting, and they can pay a very, very heavy price for this, and they do pay a price. So there's no doubt this is tough, dangerous work.
Well, then what is it that motivates somebody? Because I have this problem myself. What is it that motivates someone to try and overcome these overwhelming odds? You're taking on the whole government, sometimes international institutions, to try and expose them or try to bring the truth to people. And it's kind of it's thankless. It's overwhelming. What motivates someone to get into that line of work and to want to continue, especially like when you said, the society's collapsing around them. The buildings are crashing around them.
Yeah, so that was the key idea behind this book. Being a neuroscientist, someone who's interested in behavior and the origins of behavior, where does this rare courage come from? And I called it moral courage, and that's not a term that I made up. Other people have used it before me. So where does this motivation, this extraordinary motivation, come from? And my theory is this: that these journalists are often the last vestiges of civil society in their country. Take Russia, for example. Putin has, destroyed democracy. He's crushed the judiciary. The judges are in his pocket. He's run the NGOs out the country. There are no checks and balances on his power. And people who protest, we know what happens to them. They end up in jail. They get poisoned. They get killed, etc. The last vestige of civil society in a place like Russia has been journalism, and even now with the invasion of Ukraine, that's become even more hazardous, and many of the journalists have had to flee the country. And you can point to many other countries, similar examples. So my theory is that for these journalists, they have a very clearly defined moral compass, and when that moral compass is transgressed, then potentially they experience moral injury. And I'll define that for you. So this is a condition that can arise from witnessing or perpetrating or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass. And so within that definition, you see there are acts of commission, things that people do that can cause moral injury, or acts of omission, things that you fail to do. By keeping quiet, for example, that could cause moral injury. And moral injury is not a mental illness. It's very important that I emphasize that. But moral injury is associated with very difficult emotions such as shame and guilt, and in the case of journalists, anger as well, and disgust. And so when you've got a very finely tuned moral compass, these kind of emotions can be overwhelming. And for journalists, keeping quiet, these journalists that I profile, keeping quiet, can be the conduit to moral injury by not speaking up, by not voicing their objection to what's going on in their country, they are committing basically an act of omission. They are not doing it. They're not doing anything, and for them that's intolerable because that generates a very strong feeling of shame and guilt in them. And in response to that, they feel compelled to speak up. Now, most people, nearly everyone, of course, has a moral compass. But where do we set our moral compass? At what level? And many people would, look around and say, these are terrible things going on, but I'm not going to speak up because if I do, the state's going to come after me. The government's going to come after me. Putin's going to come after me. And so out of a sense of self-preservation, you keep quiet. You are cowed into silence. But not these journalists. They know what the risks are. They know what the odds are. They know that by speaking out, their lives are going to be very, very difficult. They're going to be harassed. They're going to be locked up. They're going to be tortured. They may even be killed. But to them, keeping quiet is so egregious. That act of omission is so unacceptable. They feel compelled to say something. And this puts them into a very select group of individuals. They are the ones, as I say, who become the last vestiges of civil society within their country. And I salute the courage. I salute their strength. Where do they get the strength from to do something like this? Because the majority of individuals do not have this kind of motivation. And I believe that all the journalists share this. This is a common thread that runs through all their narratives.
And what is it that causes this? Is it they saw an injustice in their childhood, maybe between their parents or something? And what motivates this? What creates this in them?
Right. So now you get into the whole fascinating area of where does this come from? Where does character come from? Where, what forms us as people? Where do we get our behavioral characteristics? And the old, nature versus nurture argument. And I think it's a combination of both. So, some of these journalists, their developmental histories are fascinating. I'll give you some examples. I profile a woman in Azerbaijan, Khadija Ismailova, and she has been relentless in exposing corruption. Azerbaijan is a very corrupt country. Her father was in the government. He was a minister. Azerbaijan is very rich in terms of oil revenue. And he looked at the government and saw tremendous corruption. He saw that oil revenues were being pilfered and taken by politicians. And so he did a rare thing in Azerbaijan. He spoke out. He said, hey, this corruption is unacceptable. And he paid a tremendous price. He was kicked out of the government and never worked again in Azerbaijan. But Khadija, growing up, lived this. She saw what her father had done. She saw the consequences for the family, that suddenly they went from being on the inside, father a minister, all the perks that came with it, to being discarded on the outside, financial difficulties, the family under tremendous pressure. She saw the price that her father paid for speaking out. Now she's an adult, living in the same country, and she sees terrible corruption. She sees, government malfeasance, and she doesn't keep quiet. And the government comes after her in a brutal way. They put cameras in her apartment. They film her being intimate with her boyfriend, and they post it on a website as a porn website to try and break her. Now, this is in an Islamic country where there are lots of, restrictions in terms of, sex before marriage, stuff like that. And so they're trying to deeply shame her. And still, she doesn't stop. Still, she does. And she continues doing it because for her, there's a moral imperative. And they lock her up on bogus tax charges, and she spends time in jail. But still, she doesn't stop because for her, keeping quiet is worse than anything that the government can throw at her. Where did that come from? Well, she saw her father speak out and pay a terrible price. She's following, in his footsteps, but paying an even greater price. And I can give you other examples of this as well. David Frankel, who is a Russian photojournalist, his career is a physicist. He didn't start out his working life as a journalist. He was a physicist. But looking around at Russia and the egregious human rights abuses perpetrated by the government in Putin was for him intolerable. And he felt that he couldn't keep doing his work as a physicist. He needed to make a moral stand against what he saw as the destruction of democracy, the nascent democracy in Russia after the collapse of communism. And so he picked up his camera and he started to film with a focus on human rights. And of course the government came after him. And at a demonstration, goons roughed him up and they broke his arm. It was actually filmed. There's a film online of David Frankel having his arm broken. But still, he keeps working. The day after having his surgery, he's still at his desk, working on protest and photographs. When you look at his history, his father, who wasn't a photographer, picked up a camera during the dark days of communism and started to photograph Jewish refuseniks, those Jews who wanted to leave Russia and get out and go to Israel and other places. And of course, the government came down very hard on those Jews. Well, David Frenkel's father secretly photographed these individuals to create a historical record. And now we see the son doing the same thing. So you can see, I put it to you, there's an element of learned behavior here, of these great journalists having a role model in a parent who was prepared to take a moral stand on something. But you don't see that in all journalists. I just highlight certain examples for you. The other journalists in which the motivation is more complex and one can just theorize about it. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about
Please.
Yeah, so for me, you have this really incredible story of the great South African Namibian journalist Gwen Lister, who grew up under apartheid. And, under apartheid, everything was divided along racial lines. And so as a kid, 15 years of age, at the height of apartheid, she's traveling on a bus in Cape Town. And the buses were segregated. White people sat, on the ground floor, and black people had to climb to the upper level. And the bus stops, and an elderly black woman gets on laden down with parcels, and this 15-year-old white kid instinctively gets up to give her her seat at the front of the bus in an area reserved for white people. The other passengers on the bus, the white passengers, are furious. They start shouting at the kid, how can you do something like this? But she sticks to it and she does it. Now, when you look at Gwen Lister's history, she didn't come from a politicized family. I don't think her parents supported apartheid, but they didn't oppose it. She just came from a typical middle-of-the-road, middle-class white family that was getting by during the apartheid years and not voicing any strong objection to the morality of it all. So where does this kid get this motivation from? And then when you follow the course of her life thereafter, it's remarkable. She goes to university in Cape Town. She protests against apartheid. She wants to go into journalism because she realizes that through journalism she can have a powerful voice to promote democracy and racial equity. She also realizes that if she stays in South Africa, it's going to take her longer to develop a career as a journalist. But if she goes to neighboring Namibia, which is being occupied by South Africa illegally at the time, in breach of the United Nations resolution, if she goes to Namibia, she will have a quicker pathway to moving up the ranks in journalism where she can have a voice to protest. And she does that. And she gets to Namibia, and she has this conviction that she's got to speak out against the oppression of Namibians, at the oppression of political parties, freedom parties in Namibia. The South African government comes after her very, very hard indeed. She's arrested. She's under surveillance. Local white Namibians turn on her. They shun her. She eventually ends up forming her own newspaper, starting her own newspaper called The Namibian. Her offices are firebombed. People drive past. They shoot bullets at her. She's getting harassed with, phone calls in the evening. The pressure of it all undermines her marital relationships, and still she sticks to it. And at the end of the day, she ends up playing a pivotal role in Namibia getting its independence, getting rid of South African occupation, and emerging as a free and democratic country. So, you have this remarkable life from a 15-year-old girl that gets up and gives a seat on a bus to a black woman to someone who ends up playing such a pivotal role in a country getting its freedom and shedding the yoke of apartheid. And so, at the end of it all, she says something to me. She was speaking to a religious leader, a man of color in Namibia, who said to her, like with a sense of wonder, what made a little white girl like you do something like this? And Gwen didn't really know. She didn't quite know how to answer other than, it's the right thing. Well, if you look at my theory is that when you've got a very finely tuned moral compass, as she does have, when you see egregious acts, and certainly apartheid was grossly egregious, it offends your moral sensibility. And keeping quiet, an act of omission, makes you feel shameful about yourself. You feel guilty. And that becomes this driving factor for her. Even though, by speaking out, the consequences for her have been very, very difficult at times, a very dangerous life at times, a life in which, there's tremendous financial pressures, many, many negative things come with speaking out. But at the end of the day, you feel good about yourself because you don't have moral injury. Your moral compass has been the antidote to moral injury. And that kind of theme you can follow through all the journalists that I profile. There's this constant theme, a constant refrain that unites all these 19 remarkable journalists.
Dr. Feinstein, how did you choose these 19 journalists?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my work, I was helped by the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a wonderful organization that looks after journalist safety. So they often, they acknowledge every year journalists who do work like this. And so I went onto the website and I read about these journalists. I've also been around journalists a lot over the last 20 plus years because of my research on the topic. So I'm familiar with, many journalists in many different countries who do this remarkable work. And ultimately, you've got to make choices and, whittled it down to 19. The book originally started out as a series of articles that I wrote for the Globe and Mail in Canada. I was given one article a month on a journalist of my choice to highlight their moral courage. And so after a year, there were 12 profiles, and then a publisher wanted to turn it into a book. So I had to, boost the number of journalists. I found another group. So yeah, it was hard to select them because there's so many wonderful journalists like this, and they all share this similar theme. I wanted to make sure that, that men and women were equally represented in the book. I think it was very important because a lot of this very courageous work is being done by women, who, by the way, are particularly vulnerable because of the risk of sexual assault. And that really comes out very strongly in the history of Neha Dixit, the Indian journalist who has taken a stand against the repressive Indian government of Narendra Modi, and she's being hammered online with tremendous abuse, much of it sexual, very violent sexual stuff, which is what women have to put up with when they're harassed like this. So I think women are particularly vulnerable to certain threats. So it's very important for me to have the women well represented in my book, and then I wanted a scatter of countries that we in Canada don't think about from day to day, places like Azerbaijan and Bangladesh and Paraguay, places like that in which journalists are doing such remarkable work.
Well, we're talking to Dr. Anthony Feinstein. The book is Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. You mentioned men and women. Have you discovered any insights and a difference perhaps in what motivates men and motivates women to have this moral courage to take on these astronomical odds?
It seems to be very similar. I mean, my theory that by speaking out, by doing something, you avoid the acts of omission, so you don't experience the guilt and shame that comes with silence. Both men and women seem to share that. What they don't share is the risks that come thereafter. I mean, it's dangerous, very dangerous for both men and women to do this kind of work. But as I said before, women are more vulnerable to sexual assault. They are assaulted sexually more often than men. I mean, I look back over the course of my 20 plus years researching journalists. We see this as a constant. When you look at, for example, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder in journalists who do dangerous work in war zones, you see higher levels of PTSD symptoms in women. And if you go into the general population, you look at the United States population, for example, there are going to be higher rates of PTSD in women,
Really?
Probably because women are assaulted more often than men. Sexual assault, they're more vulnerable to that. So yes, we see similar motivating factors amongst the journalists, but we see that the consequences can be different for them because of their sex.
Fascinating. You mentioned that women have more PTSD than men, because I do a lot of shows about men murdered by police, unjustly, innocent men, unarmed men killed by police, and it's always the women of the family that come on the show that just can't give up. They cannot let go of the injustice that happened to their family member, and just will have such bravery and courage in their life to devote to stand up to that kind of oppression.
Very much so, yeah.
You found that too?
Well, the matriarch, it's just such a powerful force. The person who holds the family together, the glue who holds it together. It's remarkable. Yeah.
Now we discussed the consequences that these journalists face. What about in their personal relationships with their marriages, their families, their kids?
Well, that's a really interesting observation because, coming back to the research that we've done over the past 20 plus years, I've accumulated a very large database, over 1,000 frontline journalists, a rich behavioral database on this group, the demographics, PTSD symptoms, depression symptoms, substance abuse, etc. They come from many different cultures and countries, Canadian journalists covering foreign wars, American journalists covering foreign wars, so they're Western journalists, but they're also local journalists from places like Kenya, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, Israel, Mexico. So they're all in this very large database, and you have to be very careful when you compare people from different cultures and different languages because there are very strong cultural nuances when it comes to trauma responses. But what you're able to do statistically is you could look at each individual country and extract what are the risk factors and the protective factors for something like PTSD, trauma reaction. So you can go into each country and do it, and then you can compare risk factors and protective factors across countries. Statistically, that's a very valid way of looking at data like this. And so we did that in this large database. And what we found was that the single biggest protective factor for a journalist's emotional health is a good relationship. If you've got good relationships, they're a buffer for your emotional health. They help one, they nourish one. But you can't take relationships for granted. You've got to work at them. You've got to, devote time to them. And so when you have journalists who become completely engrossed in their work to the exclusion of many other things, then you run the risk of a relationship fraying, that relationships can suffer. And when that happens, you lose your biggest protective factor in terms of your emotional health. Now, I should state that this finding of good relationship helping emotions is of course not unique to journalists. It's been well known in psychiatry. You see it in general population data time and time again. Good relationships are they're healthy for you. They're good for your emotions. But it certainly applies to journalists, and I think it takes on a particular urgency in this group because when you're dealing with trauma, when you're dealing with harassment and difficult topics in your work, you want to come home to a place that is free of conflict, in which there's going to be support, there's going to be a good relationship, in which there's going to be a nourishing home environment. And if you don't come back to that, it makes your life much more complicated, and it further compromises your emotional health. Some of the journalists profiled in my book have fantastic relationships, are very supportive partners who understand why the journalist is doing it and support them and stay with them, notwithstanding the considerable dangers that come with this work. And by the way, those dangers are not focused just on the journalist. These bad regimes go after their families.
Right.
Dictatorial leaders, intolerant authoritarian leaders know that if you want to try and break someone, you don't just go after the individual, but you target the family, the children, the parents, etc. So, the journalists know that the consequences that come with this work that might affect family, and they have to, I think, have a quite extraordinary partner who understands that as well and stays with them. And certainly a number of these journalists have that. But then there are also those journalists whose work has been instrumental in putting an end to a relationship as well, that a partner just couldn't take the heat that came with this kind of, and that and that's very, very painful because the journalist doesn't just lose someone that they love, they don't just lose this relationship, but they're also losing a very significant source of support for them.
And isn't there something too that when you live that kind of life of trauma, of social injustice, you're fighting injustice, you're not attracted to a stable home life. You're attracted to other people that are also involved in trauma, affected by trauma and chaos in their life. Is that a fact that you've discovered?
Well, I think what you're talking about is what geneticists call assortative mating. Birds of a feather flock together kind of thing. That, people with the same kind of behavioral characteristics find one another, and to a degree that's true. But that said, many of these journalists come from just very stable, middle-class families in which there wasn't this element of, risk-taking or danger or whatever. So I think, one has to be careful about generalizing, but certainly your observation is true for some of these individuals, for sure it is. And you see that same profile amongst frontline journalists as well, but not always. Once again, I just come back to the observation that, there are many journalists who have stellar careers as war correspondents, war photographers, who actually come from very stable middle-class families in which their parents never took risks. They had, 9-to-5 jobs, and they've got siblings who followed in the same, the same pathway as their parents. And you've got this one journalist who's doing this remarkable work that's so different to their family members. And by the way, we've explored reasons for that as well using, neuroscience, which is fascinating.
Well, expand on that, please.
Yeah. So, in my work over the years, I've come across sets of twins, one of whom is a frontline journalist and the other one is not. And the question is, why could you have individuals who are genetically identical go in such fundamentally different directions in terms of their career? And so I got a small grant that allowed me to bring in one set of twins to my lab in Toronto. And I'll tell you about these twins. They were women, sisters, very close. And we confirmed that they were identical twins, monozygotic twins, so they had the same genetic material. They grew up together in a small English village. Their mother dressed them in the same kind of clothes. I asked them to bring their photograph album with them. And you see these photographs of, mom dressing them in the identical outfits. They were known as 21 and 22. They were indistinguishable. And then as they got to adolescence, their behavior starts diverging. And one twin spontaneously picks up, leaves this quiet rural English life, and goes off traveling and ends up in Brazil, where she learns Portuguese, and she ends up, to cut a long story short, becoming a very famous war correspondent and getting, a lot of awards and recognition for her work. This was a woman who could, navigate around the Angolan Civil War solo by herself as a woman, showing tremendous courage doing this work. The twin that was left behind was distraught at losing her sister. And so she thought, well, maybe I should try something different. But she didn't feel compelled to do it. So she just kind of went across the channel from England to France. And after a week, just couldn't stand it and came back home. She wanted, the comfort of her home life. And when you look at her career thereafter, she married young, had 2 children, works part-time, and, has a very traditional upper middle class life, whereas her sister married late, never had children, doesn't manage money well, smokes, maybe drinks a bit too much. So you find 2 fundamentally different behavioral phenotypes, and yet genetically they're identical. And we tried to work out why. So we ran a number of biochemical tests. We had a look at a enzyme called monoamine oxidase, which breaks down a neurotransmitter such as dopamine, and dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters that is associated with risk-taking behavior. And we showed that the journalist sister has low levels of monoamine oxidase, potentially higher levels of dopamine. Her co-twin has a different biological configuration. So we're starting to get clues from neurotransmitters why the behavior is different. But the most fascinating observation was we looked at their epigenetics. And the epigenetic structures, these are these little switches on genes that turn on or turn off the expression of a gene. And we were able to show some very significant epigenetic differences between these 2 women who are genetically identical. And there was evidence to suggest that the woman who went off to Brazil at an early age, who learned Portuguese, who ended up, covering many wars in Africa, she had a particular epigenetic structure that allowed her to better modulate anxiety, whereas her co-twin never had that. And so when the co-twin tried to emulate what her sister was doing, she became overwhelmed by anxiety. It was quite striking that in my lab in Toronto, when we put the non-journalist twin into an MRI machine, she had a panic attack and we had to get her out. So, you start getting biological clues that tell you what allows a person to do this. Now, one set of twins, you can't build up a compelling case. It's just one example of something that is really interesting that suggests there are going to be biological differences that allow a person to do this kind of work and stop someone else from doing it. And almost surely that plays a role in motivation and what drives these individuals to do this kind of work.
Incredible. the coping skills. You mentioned substance abuse, relationship problems. What about suicide? Do you see suicides in this group?
Well, I think that's a topic that's not spoken about. The answer is almost surely yes. Suicide is unfortunately common in our society. It's one of these epidemiological observations that the often high rates of suicide in first world countries, rich countries. So yes, journalists are not immune from this. And I've certainly come across stories of journalists who've committed suicide. It's not written about a lot. It hasn't been researched. But it's a risk. It's an absolute risk. So when you are vulnerable to a condition like major depression, for example, and now there's good data to show that the rates of depression in frontline journalists are higher than what you'd expect in the general population. And that, and that's easy to understand why. If you're spending your whole career around difficult places like war zones and you're seeing so much death and dying and destruction, then potentially it leaves you vulnerable to depression. Well, one of the consequences of depression is suicide. Indeed, when you look at the American Psychiatric Association's criteria, diagnostic criteria for major depression, one of the criterion is suicidal thoughts and suicide. So there it is. It's well recognized that people with a major depression are vulnerable when it comes to suicide. And if you've got a group of individuals who have higher rates of depression than you find in the general population, then by extension, this is a group that will be vulnerable to suicide. And sadly, it does happen from time to time.
Your book, Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists, the photography in this book, okay? When you look at the expressions they're captured on the faces of these journalists, you can just see their whole life. You can see the pain. You can see the trauma. You can see the paranoia, the courage. You can see it in their faces. Did you have the same photographer for all of this? How did you work that out to capture this?
No, we didn't. No, we didn't. And here I have to acknowledge a woman called Claire van der Meesch, who is the photo editor at the Globe and Mail in Toronto. I approached her and said, can you help me find photographers in each of these countries? It would have been too expensive to have a photographer and fly him to, 18 different countries. So we had to use a local photographer. And Claire, with her tremendous knowledge of photography and her Rolodex that covers the world, she was able to identify photographers who then I would commission to go and take photographs of these journalists. And I agree that they did a wonderful job. I mean, Claire chose tremendous photographers, and the photography does justice to the essays and the journalists' histories.
Oh yeah. I suspected it wasn't the same photographer, but the overall theme, it really captures the look in their faces. Oh my goodness!
No doubt. I had to commission each photographer individually and explain what it was about. Yeah, they did a great job.
One of the questions here that your publicist sent over, why even in the U.S. and Canada we should be worried about threats to free press and to democracy itself. What would you have to say about that?
Oh, I think that's really valid.
Me too.
One of the journalists in my book from Serbia, Stefan Doktonovic, said to me, rulers in your country learn from the playbooks in our country. They look at the way dictatorial, intolerant leaders in places like Russia, Hungary, Serbia control the media, try and control society. They look and they learn from us, and they borrow those techniques because it's a standard playbook. Denigrate the press, go after them, trash them, make them out to be the enemy of the people, undermine their credibility, boost false news, fake news. There's a set way of doing it. And that kind of playbook is very tempting to authoritarian leaders wherever they are, including, United States, Canada, United Kingdom, whatever, within our Western democracies. And so those kind of threads that you see linking countries like Russia and Hungary and increasingly India and Turkey, Bangladesh, Syria, Afghanistan, those kind of techniques that undermine the media are seeping into our society as well, to our detriment. And so this becomes a warning call to us, don't think that the problems that are taking place far from our shores in countries where civil societies collapse, don't think that we are completely immune from that. We're not. And we already see some of those trends taking root close to home. So when people read this book, you don't just marvel. You should not just marvel at the courage of these journalists doing this work far away from our shores in North America, but also be aware that the bad things happening elsewhere could very easily happen close to home, and indeed are starting to happen close to home. And we have to be vigilant about that, because authoritarian leaders know that if you want to control society, you've got to control the media. You've got to control the media.
But then why didn't you choose? Like we have journalists in this country. Off the top of my head, I could think of Gary Webb, who was driven to suicide after exposing Iran-Contra cocaine dealing. You didn't choose to highlight or portray any U.S. journalists or Western journalists.
Correct. And I consciously did that for a number of reasons. Number one, my publisher, G Editions, brought out another book of mine 4 years back called Shooting War, in which I had a profile of 18 wonderful photographers who were all predominantly from Western countries, incredible photographers. One of the criticisms of that book was, well, you're only focusing on, these celebrity, big-name Western photographers. What about all the other photographers who are doing so many remarkable things? And that criticism had a little bit of validity. It wasn't quite true because, a lot of my research has been, in non-Western countries. We've done research in Kenya and Iran and Syria and Afghanistan. So, Namibia, Botswana. So, people are not fully familiar with my work, but certainly their point was that book focused on many of them household names in the West. What about the rest of the world? And so I wanted to acknowledge that. I wanted this book to be a reflection on all these remarkable deeds that are being carried out in countries far from our shores. Not to minimize the courage of local journalists, which I think is incredible at times. But, we also have to recognize that we are very privileged in our society, that we can still speak out. We can still say, things about our government and not be arrested. It might bring down, the rage of social media on us, but we have freedom of expression. We have many luxuries that other people don't have. Many liberties, I should say, it's a much better word. Many liberties that other people don't have. So I wanted to focus on those individuals who don't have these liberties, who work and live in countries that, from day to day aren't even in our consciousness, but who are making such a brave stand. And then extrapolate from that and say, by the way, what's going on over there could very easily happen over here, and it's starting to happen over here, so we need to be vigilant.
Yeah, I would encourage people to go, when you're searching for this book on Amazon, Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists, I'd encourage you to click on the author name, Anthony Feinstein. Many books on this topic. There's one on neurobehavioral consequences. The average guy is probably not going to read that, but many of these, Shooting War, like you said, Journalists Under Fire, The Psychological Hazard of Covering War, the third one down, A Battle-Scarred Hidden Cost of the Border War. Now, has Dr. Anthony Feinstein been exposed to war and battle yourself that cause you to be so affected by this?
You ask good questions, Ed. So you could hear from my accent that I'm not Canadian-born, although I've lived in Canada for 30 years. I grew up in South Africa, and I grew up in a country under apartheid. And I left in 1986 because I was being hounded mercilessly by the military for conscription. So I finished medical school and I was conscripted like all white males. If you refused conscription, you went to jail for 3 years. It's a little bit like your Vietnam situation. If you didn't heed your call up, you went to jail, where they would rough you up. So I went into the military as a doctor, and got sent to a war in northern Namibia at Angola, where for a period I was a combat medic. Bitterly opposed to the war, I should add, but there I was, working as a combat medic. So I saw war up close, and I saw what it did to people. I saw how it broke people, how it destroyed communities. I saw how it fragmented families. I also saw remarkable courage, by the way, in the midst of battle, which is also something you don't forget. And so, war has this ability, and it's terrible to say it, but it brings out the best and the worst in people. For the most part, the worst, of course, because war is such an abomination. But in the midst of it all, you do see remarkable acts of courage, and when you witness it, you don't forget it. And as someone who's intrigued by human behavior, you want to know more about it. Where does this come from? What drives people to do these things? What protects them? What keeps them well despite the pressures and dangers that they confront? And so to a large degree, that's informed my work with journalism. I think, you ask a really prescient question. Going back and when looking at my developmental history as a young man, I was in my early 20s when I was exposed to this. I didn't know it at the time, but it set the course for one aspect of my research career, which is this, fascination with journalism and trauma. Which I say is my night job. It's not my day job. I still run a multiple sclerosis lab, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I can imagine that is too. Yeah, no, but back to the book, Moral Courage: 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. We only have about 5 minutes left. Can you think of something I haven't asked you that you really want the audience to know, or maybe a couple of anecdotes from some of these journalists you'd like to tell us about? Perhaps that guy in Paraguay who seems to be under armed security 24 hours a day.
Yeah, that's just a remarkable story. This was a man who exposed the drug violence in his country and the corruption within Paraguay. And the cartels, of course, came after him in a very significant way. The cartels were killing journalists in Paraguay, and he wouldn't keep quiet. And the government had to basically give him his own armed protection, 24 hours a day. 24 hours a day, he lived with a group of armed people in his house who were there to keep him alive, year after year. The only place in his house where they wouldn't go were his bedroom and his bathroom. When he woke up in the morning and he stepped out of his bedroom, there they were, constantly with him, a group of individuals to protect him and keep him alive. And he endured this for years and kept doing his work. It cost him his relationship with his family. He felt that he had to separate from his family to protect them because, as we've spoken about earlier, the cartels know how to silence people. They go after family members. We showed that very clearly in research that we did in Mexico, that if the cartels want to silence journalists, an effective way of doing it is to target their siblings and their children, etc. So, this poor man in Paraguay got separated from his family because of the nature of his work, and still he kept doing it. He never backed off, and for years, 17 years, he lived with this armed escort. Wherever he went, they would climb in the car with him, and someone would travel in a car behind him, essentially to protect him and keep him alive. He couldn't do the kinds of things that we just take for granted, like go to the corner and have a cup of coffee at a Starbucks, or go and sit in a restaurant. Wherever he went, his steps were followed by this armed group to keep him alive, and they did keep him alive. The journalists who never had this, who were working at drug stories in Paraguay, were killed. But eventually, he couldn't take it anymore, and he came to the United States, where he is now living there. But he endured this for 17 years. It's an incredible story. And by the way, he felt compelled to carry a gun, which in my experience is almost unique amongst journalists, because journalists don't carry weapons. They don't regard themselves as combatants. But such was the threat against him. So explicit was the threat that he felt compelled, notwithstanding having these armed guards with him all the time. He felt compelled to carry a gun as well. Such was his level of fear.
Have you come across journalists who've given up and not given up, but stepped away from the public eye, stepped away from the work, as an example of moral courage for their family, for their loved ones?
Well, you raise a very good point, because in Rushmore, Kidmore's book on moral courage, he identifies 3 factors that define it. Number 1, you've got your principles. Number 2, you've got the desire to act, or your endurance. And the third thing is the way you deal with danger. And so you've got to have all 3 ingredients to have your moral courage, which I think is true. Which means that from time to time, when the danger becomes overwhelming or intense, when the threat is so imminent, you should step back. And that's what the Mexican photojournalist, did when the cartels came after him. When he realized that life was so dangerous, Felix Marquez, he realized life was so dangerous, he had to go to exile for a year before he came back. And so that's sensible because, it kept him alive. When you look at the Russian journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, she didn't do that. She's very celebrated in the West. She was a journalist who was appalled by the course Russia was taking, after communism. She saw Putin dragging Russia back into, the old authoritarian day in which the KGB ruled. And she was vociferous in her criticism of Putin. In particular, she was incensed by the way Russia conducted this war in Chechnya. And so she went after Putin relentlessly, and she was doing it against the backdrop of, Putin killing journalists. And everybody knew that journalists die in Russia for saying these things, and she would not keep quiet. And people were warning her, telling her, you're going to be next. She even said it herself at the funeral of one of her colleagues that she was going to be next. And she never went into exile. She just kept writing about Putin and criticizing him in very strong language. Things like, why I detest this man. And in the end, they killed her. They killed her on Putin's birthday. There's the message, On Putin's birthday, someone killed her in her apartment building. So, yes, there is a terrible price that people pay for this extraordinary courage. And, some of the other journalists, try not to sail so close to the wind that when the danger becomes so extreme, like, Mr. Marquez, he stepped back. He went into exile for a year, and then he came back into Mexico to continue the photographs.
Retreat is a respectable tactical maneuver to live to fight another day. It's not always associated with cowardice or giving up or surrender. Dr. Anthony Feinstein, we're out of time. I've enjoyed this so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry we're out of time because I really enjoyed it too, and thank you for your question.
No, thank you so much. Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. Anytime you want to come back, let me know to discuss any of this, any of your books. I would love to have you back, my friend.
I'd be delighted. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.